Bungalow Bill here, and welcome back to From the Depths. If you've been following my channel for a while, you know that quite a while, sort of when I did the Very Hard Neater playthrough, I made a ramming vehicle for that. That was more messing around with breadboards, knowing that ramming was going to be reworked with the intent of revisiting the ramming mechanics at some point. Well, for the past few weeks, I have been looking into the ramming mechanics quite a bit and trying to work around what's viable and what's non-viable on the beta test branch. Speaking of which, if you are on the alpha test branch, you should now be on the beta test branch. The alpha test branch has been deprecated with the intent of moving beta to stable sometime in the next few days, but who knows when that's actually going to happen. Given how releases have been being done now with no patch notes, which is why I have not done a video about them in quite a long time, because I honestly can't figure out what the changes are. It could be done without warning at almost any time. So, why are we looking at this? This is not a ramming vehicle, but it is illustrative of sort of one of the basic tenets of ramming, which is making a maneuverable vehicle. I've made a series of these. They're basically batteries, ion thrusters, electric engines, and some radius. So this is the 1R version because it's one battery. I've got a 2, 4, 8, and 16 version. The way to look at these is that you sort of have a pivot, you have a mass, and you have something pushing it. This one's currently at its steady state, where it's just spinning at some speed, although I'm going to stop them and start them all at the same time so we can look at how they accelerate from their steady state, because that's sort of illustrative of how maneuverable a ramming vehicle is as far as its ability to turn is concerned. So if I really zoom into these, what it looks like to me is a guy pushing sort of a weight in a straight line. At least if you look close enough, it's in a straight line. So when the guy starts pushing it, he's going to accelerate at a certain fixed rate, regardless of how far he is from the pivot, because he's pushing it in a straight line. The further you get from the pivot, though, the smaller the angle changes in response to pushing the block. That reduction is 1 over r. So as a result, the angular acceleration is going to get worse from a standstill by 1 over r. Double it, it's half. Quadruple it, it's a quarter. So this tells us what we already know. Longer craft turns slower. The amount is you double how long a craft is. And, it's roughly homogeneous, so the weight's evenly distributed. Well, it turns half as fast. Quadruple its length, it turns a quarter as fast. I'm going to start all of these spinning up from a standstill, just to illustrate that point.
Receiving.
And hit play. The littlest guy, twice as fast as the next guy, twice as fast as the next guy, twice as fast as the next guy, etc. At least as far as how they're accelerating from a complete standstill. Now, with a real craft, you can do things to alleviate this to some extent. This could have all of the heavy stuff in the middle and all of the thrusters at the ends. And now, the price isn't the same because you get a pretty big lever arm, and the angular moment of inertia is not being increased by as much because you're really starting to centralize all of the weight. But in some practical aspects, it is hard to do, so this sort of motivates the optimal ramming shape as being a cube, at least as far as maneuverability is concerned, for drag reasons that may need to be elongated a little bit, but it really does motivate blockier and wider designs rather than incredibly narrow and long designs. And as expected, when we look at the ramming craft that I built, well, it's not really a cube. And in my defense, that is highly beneficial as far as drag reduction is concerned. This thing has a top speed of 122 meters per second, with 25 custom jet material burn, which compares very favorably to something like the Valkyrie, which burns 40 materials per second on custom jets. But our turning circle is pretty big. Still, even with the default ramming AI, this is capable of ramming most ships in Neater. With no PN guidance, it's never going to hit some of the really fast ones, but she still does okay for herself. In terms of maneuverability, some of the length can be mitigated by moving the weight inwards. However, these steam drills are very heavy, the armor's pretty heavy, these things have to be at the front. Custom jet engines, also kind of heavy, have to be at the back. They don't really have to be, but it helps with thrust vectoring. And then I wound up with some ammo at the back too, which is pretty heavy. Maybe that could be optimized, but the internals for this craft are pretty much 3 meters wide in the center. So it's really difficult. As far as optimal building is concerned, probably makes sense to pad the center out to 5 to 7 meters of materials, make her a little bit more bulky, but I did decide to name it the Damocles, named after the sword thereof, so a knife-like profile to some extent is mandatory. Another motivating factor behind the form is that I do want it to evoke a White Flare Zealot to some extent. That you should be able to look at it and think, okay, this is obviously supposed to be a White Flare's Zealot craft. It goes fast, it rams things, it's spiky, it's jagged, a little bit chaotic, although I do want to turn it down a little bit, but I'm still going to be doing additional aesthetic work on top of what it already looks like to move more in this direction, although I don't think I'm ever going to get quite this far. There's a lot of kind of weird stuff that goes on with some of the White Flare's craft that looks like just having random corner blocks tossed on and little things that are less jagged and more look like, oh, they just don't line up. So maybe some happy medium that works for me, but not really the point of this video. Back to the Damocles. As far as the actual design decisions that I made for ramming are concerned, I went with steam drills, and there are basically 3 different choices. The mechanics behind steam drills is that the different drill components have different maximum amounts of kinetic energy that they can use per hit. They all convert kinetic energy to damage at a rate of 2 to 1, and the amount of the maximum that they can convert depends on the speed that they're rotating at. So this uses a transmission set at double the ratio. Crank motors can be used instead, although you'll never really spin up this with a crank motor. It's just too much kinetic energy. So the large drill head, 2,000 kinetic energy used per hit. That's 4,000 damage per tick if you can hit every tick, or 80,000 per second. The drill extension, well, it's a quarter of that. That doesn't look so good. Sort of another consideration behind the steam drill mechanics are that, as far as I can tell, you can only collide with an enemy vehicle at one location per game tick. So there are 3 steam drills here, but only one of them can actually hit at a time. So it increases coverage, does not increase damage. The same with the length along this entire shaft. It can only hit in one place. If that's here, well, it doesn't do as much damage as the tip. Kind of unfortunate. It also means that if we're colliding anywhere else, for example, some of this rubber, we will do no impact damage at all in that tick. If we're instead hitting with a ram, we'll use the ram mechanics, which this thing's moving at like half of its max speed, well now more like 2/3. It can do around 400,000 impact damage to metal on its first impact if it hits with a ram first at top speed. Unfortunately, steam drills are one of 2 blocks that deal no impact damage when you hit an enemy. The other one is rubber. Why it's like this, I have absolutely no idea, but that's the way it is. So the ship is giving up a significant amount of initial impact damage in order to use these steam drills. I'm not really sure it's worth it, but I definitely did have to test out the steam drills. given the mechanics that I've stated, steam drills scale terribly at the current moment. I don't know if they'll get more tweaks later or not. They're still kind of in the initial form that they went into the alpha test branch in. So we'll see. Maybe things will change. Maybe they won't. At the moment, steam drills make more sense the smaller a craft you put them on because of those mechanics. Now, you can get the best of both worlds to some extent. I could have a ram on a mechanism that retracts after the initial collision, and then, resets on every ramming loop. I didn't do that, but it is certainly a thing that I could have done. One more thing about the steam drills that is very useful, and is one of the reasons that I'm using them, is that you can make them any length. So, rams, they can only attach on the back, so you can only have 2 meters of rams. A fast ramming vehicle will move 3 to 4 meters on a game tick, which means that you're not guaranteed to be able to hit with a ram. You might hit with a block behind the ram. In the case of a structural block, or basically anything except for rubber, this could easily result in your ramming vehicle just disintegrating. If it's rubber, well, it results in you losing all of your momentum and dealing no damage, which is a massive failure case for a vehicle that's dependent on rams. Stored impact damage also tends to recharge pretty slowly if you're not moving that fast and caps out pretty low, so repeated hits don't get you a lot. If you're using these rams, you really want to bounce into the target, then reset and bounce again, then reset and bounce again, as opposed to these steam drills where you're just trying to bore all the way through a target. So let's spawn in just a few targets and see what happens. We will spawn in one of my favorites because it's, well, with the difficulty in the 0.85 category, fairly high difficulty, just a little bit more expensive than us. Kind of small, kind of fast, not the easiest thing to ram. It does spawn bow on, which makes this not the best case. However, it is turning to us. We don't have any proportional navigation, that kind of thing, so we do have a little bit of trouble ramming some vehicles sometimes, but we're fine here. Already racked up about 500,000 impact damage, so we're doing better than just a ram with simple rams at the moment, but at this point our steam drill's all the way through and we are just relying on simple rams, basically these 2 spinners, to see if we can do any more. Now the Braveheart is detonating from hitting ammo stores, presumably. And we're just trying to hope that we get a little bit more impact damage. Currently, we're probably fetched up on a little bit of rubber. Yeah, that's what it looks like. But we eventually made it through. So, one observation from that, well, other than the fact that rubber's terrible, but there's really not much I can do about it, I kind of have to use it on a ramming vehicle. And enemy vehicles tend to have a lot of it in them now due to the EMP changes. And, well, steam drills, unfortunately, don't do any damage to rubber. I think this is probably an oversight, because I believe that rams do, and steam drills, given the resource investment, really should just be better than rams in most cases. So hopefully that'll get changed, but sometimes you'll hit an enemy vehicle and just stop and not be able to do anything. The other observation, these things respond to the desired roll rate of the craft. By these things, I mean the giant spiked wheels on the side. That's actually, their main purpose is kind of to push off the enemy vehicle to keep this thing in a relatively vertical orientation so it doesn't flop onto its side and wind up with these jets in the water doing absolutely nothing. So Steel Striders, very fun to ram. Something that's actually scarier than it could be are the Onyx Watchcraft, because high mass, short range effective weapons, definitely scarier than the relatively low mass, long range weapons that the Steel Striders bring to bear. We'll start with an Onyx Watchcraft that's not the scariest, although its difficulty actually relatively high. The Iron Cordon. We're going to launch flares, which will help mitigate it a little bit. There goes our flare. Some of the missiles go for it, some of them don't. We just kind of suck some of the damage. And then just start ramming. So we're already hitting with our rams a little bit, which is slowing us up. I believe we detonated that turret with the belly of our craft a little bit rather than the steam drills. The desired outcome is that we do pop explosive things with the steam drills. Really helps protect a lot of the craft. It's part of the benefit of them being that long. So we got through. The steam drills really do bring a lot of damage in those sustained ramming engagements compared to just rams, although are they better than just a big spinning ram wheel at the front with maybe a little bit of engine power thrown in? I'm not sure. They certainly don't scale as well. If you really are going big with ramming, the simple rams are really your only option. The other type of drill, other than the steam drill, completely non-viable. So, actually, in some ways, the Kingstead is scarier than the Iron Cordon, because it's just such a big chunk of metal, and it brings crams to bear, which are pretty fantastic weapons here. I do need to try to do something about the missiles that we launch, because they can be a little bit of a liability sometimes. Most of them miss us, but they do chew up these paddles sometimes, and we do kind of need them. But we're doing respectable damage. However, Kingstead, very big, very tall, very massive. It's dangerous to ram. But we survived our first bat with it. 1.6 million impact damage. However, that's only 15%. It's this big chunk of metal. Before any damage was dealt to it, it was about 1.2 million mass. That's more than double ours. When we banked a turn, we pitched down for some reason. I don't really know why. We just use airplane maneuver and ramming behavior, so at some point I'll probably put an interesting breadboard in for this type of ramming craft, but haven't made it yet. Fortunately, we have some amount of these wheel thingies left to fend off. Not as much as I would like. Rubber is incredibly fragile, and despawned the Kingstead due to low health. So, actually, let's check how low we got. It took 4% damage. That's not that bad, but once you start to lose the area that has the rams on it, it gets really dangerous really fast. There's definitely a critical point where you kind of just start disintegrating. And one more target, the Crossbones. The Crossbones is 100k more expensive than us, so, you know, it's really dangerous to just charge into these cram cannon fire like this. Now, the thing is, once we get melee like this, we really want to kill the Crossbones quickly. We do not want to take that kind of cram firepower. It's really nasty. Our steam drills aren't making contact anymore, so we're just relying on rams to get us through. It looks like the Crossbones is going to give us... nope. Either we got into its dead zone, but more likely I think we killed the AI governing. No, I think we just got into its dead zone. So we're losing some bits, it's losing some bits. Given that it's mostly made out of wood, we come out ahead a little bit. We've lost a lot of our ram coverage, though, and that's kind of a big disadvantage. I think we're fetched up on some of our own rubber. It's stopping us from getting through effectively. It's hard to tell. It looks like we should be doing ramming damage, and we're just kind of not. Oh, never mind. Yeah, so the big issue was that we wound up perfectly lined up with the rubber AI compartment, which looks like it is immune to ram damage completely now. I thought that was changed at some point, but I guess it wasn't. Anyway, that basically completely ruined our day. We eventually got a little bit more ram damage coming through, but really that's, like, I almost consider that exploit levels of just game interactions. That's just such a feels bad moment that basically the mandatory AI protection just completely neuters all possible ramming damage. It's really a feels bad moment when you try to ram vehicles and you get caught up on something like that. Also, the Crossbones does have it really has that same weight advantage that we have to deal with a lot of other more stationary vehicles, is that once we've used our initial sort of ram push, if we hit with anything that's not a ram, which is kind of inevitable when you take damage, no matter how well you're built, as I mentioned before, although we're a little bit more exposed than some vehicles, it'll damage us at about a 2-to-1 ratio. It's just not a good situation. I did try to put a lot of rubber and a lot of rams on the bottom of this craft, but it still does usually beat the Crossbones. It's just, if you hit that block of rubber, it's just kind of over. There's not a whole lot you can do about it. But if you look at a ship like the Rhea, which I doubt will be very successful against, she's got 3 guns up front and just Siwas in the rear. If you come in like this, she can't really do that much to you, which actually it looks like we might if we don't miss her entirely. Still at 99%, still functioning. The APHE on the Rhea can really mess up our day. But we're really chewing up a rear end, which is kind of the case that you'd hope for. In a lot of spawns, I doubt this would happen, and we'd take way more fire from the Rhea. I do need to see if I can do something to make the ship missile itself a little bit less. It's not terrible, but it's a little bit close for comfort. Maybe increase the downrange aim distance, I don't know, something like that. So 20% off the Rhea so far. You see, the steam drills are having a little bit of trouble impacting. We're chewing away with rams a little bit, and I think that's slowing us down. It's kind of inevitable, though. It's not like I can cover the whole front of this with steam drills. It's just not really possible. We've got our jets out of the water a little bit. This craft, I did try to make in a way that it could do that, so that in these positions it can still push itself into the enemy fairly effectively. Looks like we dipped into the water a little bit there. Which slowed us down a bit, but... And I think actually the Rhea is pushing down on us a little bit, keeping us underwater. And at the same time we're pushing up into the Rhea, but she's despawning now. Once you get to the size of the Rhea, it gets a little hard to ram with steam drills. We still got there. Didn't really take appreciable damage, but again, that fight, there's going to be a lot of luck in the draw in that fight without a breadboard that's pretty smart about how we ram. Okay, so this craft is not supposed to be in White Flare's colors. It's supposed to be in my own fleet colors. I just didn't feel like changing it. It doesn't produce any energy, so it's going to run out. I didn't spawn in a battery for it. It's supposed to operate off of a larger craft. It's called the Hunter Driller. It's a little stealth sub. It plays with 2 things. One, okay, it uses steam drills. The wide drill bit, 5x5, has the downside of only 0.4 drag reduction instead of 0.2 for the tips. So this is kind of slow. It's also very short, so if something blows up here, it blows through all the rubber and this thing dies. This actually can't successfully ram a lot of deep water guard craft, or really any craft for that matter, because unless it pops the ammo storage with these packs, it winds up popping them with the steam drill and blows itself up, because this thing has an armor cost of 17. But the two things that are interesting about it is mostly very stealthy. Its active sonar detection signature is under 100 meters. Unfortunately, this means usually most enemies have good enough gun depression that by the time they can see it, they can still shoot at it, which is kind of bad, unfortunately, but a little bit of a failure in that respect. But then the other thing is that it has no passive sonar detection range, only ion thrusters. So me messing around with the stealth sub a little bit. However, really, stealth subs, not good ramming vehicles when it comes down to it. They should probably stay considerably further from the enemy and just toss a lot of missiles around. Maybe packs if you're fighting enemy water-based vehicles and you think you can find them with passive sonar only. What's really interesting about this, though, and I wanted to talk about a little bit, is that, so when you're connecting melee lenses, they can connect to any lenses that aren't facing opposite directions, but lenses have an issue where they're just not, these aren't tough. 900 health, 30 armor, like, they're not totally frail, but if you put these on the front, they do not survive ramming the enemy vehicles. And then, given the sort of crazy angles that they tend to shoot off their beams in, they kind of have to be on the front. You can't hide them in recesses or that sort of thing to make them harder to shoot. They have to, given that they hit every tick, unlike longer range packs that you can put behind shutters and that sort of stuff, you have to have them exposed. They just get blown off a lot. These do the fun thing of, rather than using a lot of range, they use a little bit of range to do this, but these use lateral and vertical shifts. We'll look at these, which just have maximum vertical shift to just project like this without exposing them to the front. You only get 50 meters of shift this way, but it's a fun experiment. I might play around with this on a larger craft at some point, but if you cast these out in beams like this that are very straight, well, you could do that with a melee lens facing this way as well and still have it shoot out a small gap. That's at least something. But here you can do with something that at least doesn't get hit easily by frontal fire. Anyway, that's all I have for this episode. I hope you enjoyed watching, and I hope to see you in the future.